Good evening, everybody. I hope you've had a good day. As Julie says, I'm going to be talking this evening on human error and human factors. Now, this is a very wide topic, to say the least. And in the hour that we've got, I can only scratch the surface. There is a degree of interaction in this. Not that I'm expecting you to actually answer any of the questions that I ask, but there are a few things along the way for you to have a go at. So thinking caps on and off we go. So human factors are defined by the UK Health and Safety Executive as environmental, organisational and job factors, and human and individual characteristics which influence behaviour at work in a way that can affect health and safety. Well, it's not just health and safety, it's human reliability as a whole. And that can affect things like product quality as well, or, perhaps a mistake in a spreadsheet that could cost us a lot of money, or unintentionally transferring money between bank accounts. Human factors and human error impacts on every walk of life. The thing is, when we start talking about KPIs, or companies start talking about KPIs, we tend to default to lagging indicators. These are measures of failure, though, because they're after the fact. Something has happened. Whereas pivoting to take a look at our human factors allows us to take a look at leading indicators. And these are a really good indication of the culture in our organization. Things like attendance rates at safety training. How many people drop out last minute? Or how many people do you have to drag kicking and screaming into the room? When there are actions from an audit, how many are completed on time, or how many do we have to extend? Are we getting employee improvement suggestions? How long do actions take to actually get closed out? Or are people attending the health and safety committee? But one of my top ones is taking a look at near miss to accident reporting ratio. Because if that's a high figure, it shows that the culture of the organization cares about near misses and is reporting them and acting on them. And that actually is a very quick route into risk reduction as a whole. So I want to start with a tale of two coffees, with apologies to Dickens. I used to work at the Institute of Cancer Research here in London, and I used to come in quite early, mainly because I wanted to avoid the rush on the buses. And I would go up to the canteen on the 7th floor and walk up to the bean coffee, the bean coffee machine, and I'd press the button for a large Americano. It would make my coffee. I would wander to the counter, pay for it, and wander off to my office to wake up in peace. But I'd been at the organization about 6 or 7 weeks, and I was asked if I would go and spend the day at the Institute of Cancer Research other site in Sutton. Now that meant getting up an extra hour early. I was up at about 5 a.m. that day. But I arrived at Sutton, and I arrived at the canteen to find it's the same catering company, it's the same coffee machine. So all was good. I was going to be able to get my coffee. And then I stood there confused and a little annoyed as the machine made me half a cup of milky coffee. See, while it was the same coffee machine, they'd set up the control panel entirely differently. So did I go up to the counter and explain my mistake and go back and get my large Americano? Of course not. I'm British. I quietly paid and wandered off drinking my small milky coffee, although I came back about half an hour later for the large Americano. But you can see very quickly that if you've got two machines that look very similar, having the control panels consistent is really important, because what happened to me is known as a strong habit intrusion. And in fact, this has been seen in the field of anesthesia, where the controls for the different gases, anesthetic gases, etc., and oxygen, etc., are not consistent across different types of machines. And it actually took anaesthetists globally to campaign for a standard control panel layout to actually stop people dying from incorrect administration of anesthetics. Now, we're into the evening, and we're probably starting to feel a bit tired after our day at work. There was a study done some years ago looking at the whole German working population and taking a look at accident risk and its relation to time on shift. The solid line that starts at the 100% and drops down, that is the proportion of the German working population that spend those number of hours at work. If you then take a look at the jagged line that rises, this is the relative risk as people go through their working day. And we find, not surprisingly, it's very low when you start the day, and it rises, and it continues to rise until about your 5th hour at work. That's actually the post-lunch dip, because somewhere around hour 3, hour 4, we've stopped for lunch. And our body's now busy trying to digest its food, so it's diverting resources, well, to be quite frank, from the brain to the stomach. And you are at that point most likely to have an accident. Now, we can use accidents as an overall measure of error, because for there to be an accident, there most likely has been an error. So we can see we're actually at our least reliable during that post-lunch dip. And we've all sat at our desks and felt a bit tired. But we get our second wind, and lo and behold, accident risk declines until we get towards the end of the day when, to be honest, we're probably thinking about what we're having for tea, what we're going to do with the kids that evening, etc., and our accident risk rises. But for those of us who work longer than 8 hours a day, you can see the accident risk continues to rise. And in hour 10, we see a peak like in hour 5, and that's the post-dinner dip. But people working 12 hours, you can see at the end of the day, they're actually, 25, 30 times more likely to have an accident than at the beginning of the shift. The graph also actually gives us a lot of really good information about when we should plan for complex, detailed tasks that require a lot of concentration. And that really is the first 3 hours of the working day, and then hours 6 and 7. We're actually at our best then. So moving on from fatigue, now I want to talk a little bit about memory. Now, our long-term memory, this is stored knowledge of almost unlimited capacity. And I'm sure you've been surprised by some long lost memories, or memories you thought that you'd lost that actually came back to you at some point in your life. Now, retrieval speeds depends on the frequency of use of the information. And this is known as frequency gambling. The pathways to information that we use most often are much better driven. They are stronger. Our recall of that information is much faster. But equally, things that we don't use that often dwell somewhere in the dusty corner of our brain and take much more effort to recall. A good example of this is if you would think about the teachers that you had at school. Most people can remember their first teacher at school. For me, it was Miss McIntyre. But if I asked you about your 4th or 5th teacher at school, usually at that point I get a furrowed brow as people start trying to look for the information, and it takes a minute or two to come back. Now, that's the long-term memory. We also have a working memory, and it's a mental blackboard or scratch pad. We can use it to process information and to retain information whilst we need it, but as soon as we stop using it, it just fades away. It has a limited capacity, 7 plus or minus 2 items is a figure that's often quoted, but it is exceedingly susceptible to interruption. I can give you some information to remember and then have a conversation with you, and your ability to remember that will fade very quickly indeed. It's also very sensitive to too much information. If I give you more information than your working memory can deal with, actually, the first thing that happens is information overload, and actually our ability to use that working memory declines. This is a very confusing array of control panels from a nuclear power station of the same vintage as the one at 3 Mile Island that melted down. Now, communication is of itself another problem. Stan Kaplan said that 50% of the problems with communication are due to individuals using the same words with different meanings. And the remaining 50% are due to individuals using different words with the same meaning. Now, I'm very used to working in multicultural environments. And the different words that different cultures use for things can get confusing. Then you get things like acronyms, which can mean different things in different industries. And as we move around, or even just different companies within the same industry, as we move around, we can get confused very quickly. So checking that we actually understand what's being said is very important. And our vision actually fools us quite a lot. If we look at the picture on the left-hand side, you'll see that the gentleman's mouth is in focus, but the rest of it is somewhat blurred. And that's because we have two types of vision, peripheral and foveal. The foveal vision, this is the macula where we actually have most of the nerve endings that sense light. And it makes up about 1% of our overall vision. Everything else around is our peripheral vision. Now, it may well be in focus, but it's processed with low priority, and it certainly doesn't have the same fidelity. So if things change, we actually have to shift our vision to go and look at that. But as a result of all of this, our clear view of the world around us is actually a time-lapsed patchwork of field-generated pictures. So if things change whilst we're working, we might not notice. Right, I want to take a couple of minutes to take a look at procedures. Now, rather than tell you that procedures are important and that they need to reflect what we're actually doing, you may or may not have seen this video on either TikTok, Twitter, or LinkedIn, but it tells the story of working procedures far better than I can.
Step 1. Get 2 pieces of bread out. Got 'em. Get a butter knife and get some PB. Take 1 piece of bread, spread it around with the butter knife.
No, Dad, with the peanut butter.
I'm just doing what it says. It says take 1 piece of bread, spread it around with the butter knife.
Hold on.
Get some jelly, rub it on the other half of the bread.
No, Dad, open the jelly.
Well, it doesn't say to do that. Put the breads together on top of each other. Take a big bite. This doesn't taste like a peanut butter jelly sandwich.
Sorry, I had to make it extremely specific.
Oh, good. I'm starving. Take 2 pieces of white bread out of the bag. Take the lid off the jar of peanut butter. Get a butter knife and stick it inside of the peanut butter jar. With the knife, scoop a bit of peanut butter out of the...
That means like a lot.
A bit means a lot?
In my world.
There we go.
You're doing better than before, though.
Open the jelly jar. Squeeze it onto the other piece of bread.
No.
Done.
Sorry, there is more to that clip. I would suggest that you go and search for the rest of it. It is very funny, but it goes to show very quickly that procedures that make sense in one person's head do not necessarily make sense to the operator. And a lot of the time, unless there's really good training to go along with your procedures, you will get results such as this. So these are all things that make human error more likely if we are tired, or if we're not communicating well, if we're not seeing the right thing, if we've not got the right instructions. I want to talk a little bit now about how we actually process information and how that manifests as error. When we first learn a task, we are performing at the level of knowledge. Over time, we get better. We learn some rules of thumb that can help us. And then eventually we get skilled. Knowledge-based performance is you cannot perform other tasks. You are reliant on immediate feedback. If you think back to when you were learning to drive a car, if it had a gear stick, I'm pretty sure that the first time you changed gear, it wasn't smooth. I certainly know there was crunching that I could hear when I was trying it, because that's actually quite a complex motor task, and you're having to multitask. So it's actually quite difficult. So the first of the things that happens at the level of knowledge is our working memory gets in the way. It's very linear. So if we actually have to try to process information in our working memory, it gets quite difficult. So I'm going to put a random set of letters up on the screen. I'm going to give you a few seconds to take a look at them and then see if you can repeat them back in alphabetical order. Sorry, I'm sneaky. I'm not going to let you look at them for too long. So there's the correct answer. And I think if you are particularly good at languages, that probably came fairly easy. But for those of us who are perhaps not quite so good in that area, there's probably a furrowed brow and a certain difficulty in achieving a task like that. What this demonstrates is where a task requires manipulation of information, we should be making it easy for an individual by providing a computer aid or even just a notepad. So the next thing is, I said that you might not necessarily see things changing in your workplace when we were talking about vision, but this is another layer on that. It's extremely difficult to detect what's missing, wrong, or out of place. So can you find the cat? I'm not going to give you long. I'll give you about maybe 10, 15 seconds on the slide. Then I will zoom in. And I promise you there is actually a cat there. I'm not playing tricks on you. Perhaps it's a little bit easier if I zoom in like this. And if you're still hunting around the screen, perhaps that'll help, or even that. And it's quite amazing that people then can't unsee the cat. Because if I come back to that photograph, now the cat is immediately visible. There's a number of things going on here. The main one is I set you up to fail in how I framed the task. If I'd have said, find the ginger sleeping cat, which would have been a more accurate representation of the task, you probably would have found it quite quickly. And again, this is down to procedures, you see. If our instructions to people aren't clear and don't give them our shared understanding, or our understanding of the task, then very quickly we set someone up to fail. Confirmation bias is a real danger as well when we're operating at the level of knowledge, because we're trying to work things out and we look for information that supports our decision. We will create a mental model and we then follow it. We don't look for contradictory information. Why? Because we think we're right. And actually, you can then see that transferred to a group. So everyone's seeing or understanding the same thing. Groupthink is certainly something to look up, because you can have someone with a very strong opinion override the thoughts of the rest of the group. And actually, you can turn them around 180 degrees and just about make them think that black is white. An example of this was in DNA fingerprinting when this first came into crime detection in the 80s and early 90s, because scientists had told us that the possibility of two people having the same DNA fingerprint was 30 billion to 1, unless they were congenital twins. And this is what a DNA fingerprint looked like. And you can see, well, actually, I'm meant to be reading all of these individual black bands, but there are these dark shaded areas. Do they mean anything? And this is the problem. Everything from processing errors, sample contamination, subjective interpretation, well, it gave rise to false positive rates as high as 1 in 18, which you may remember from the late 90s and the early 2000s. There were a lot of miscarriages of justice around DNA fingerprinting that were revealed. Again, at the level of knowledge, we see overconfidence, because at that point, we don't fully appreciate the complexity of the task. We may underestimate how difficult something could be or how dangerous something can be. So it's the how hard can it be, or hold my beer error. And there are a lot of contributors here. Confirmation bias, because we think we understand, or maybe we've planned really well, but we've not actually thought about any of the downfalls that could happen along the way. We've spent a lot of time setting something up, or maybe the plan is the product of a few elite people whom we trust. But the problem here is we forget to plan for failure. It's not in our nature to say, why wouldn't that work? Or what could go wrong? And biased reviewing comes in here. Ever checked, rechecked, checked again, only to find a mistake later? Because we all check our plans, often more than once, but we're biased about our own judgment. We also check less carefully under pressure. You ever noticed a typo in your email after you've sent it? Not for this forum, but I've had a couple in my own emails that have been, well, quite famous and actually fairly rude, but totally unintended. But also, we are very biased about reviewing the work of others that we know get it right most often. Because after all, why would I spend time checking the work of a subject matter expert? So these are some of the mistakes that you can make when you're first learning a task. We then get to the point where we get some rules of thumb. And this is a familiar or seemingly familiar situation. We've got some attention based on it because we've got previous experience. So these stored rules control behavior, but remember, long-term memory recall is based on frequency gambling. So it is the rules that we've established that we've used most often that will come to mind first. But we can perform some other tasks at the same time. So if I ask you, which wartime politician said the following: the lamps are going out all over Europe and we shall not see them lit again in our lifetime? Well, If Churchill came to mind, then, as I suspect it will have done for quite a few of you, I primed you that it was a wartime politician. And the standard answer to that would be Churchill for so many things. In this case, it was Ian Gray, the foreign minister before the First World War. And this is an example of rule strength. It has overridden any other memory that you might have. Then we have rule rigidity. And this is an example of effectively schoolyard logic, that cutting people with knives is a crime and surgeons cut people with knives, so surgeons are criminals, aren't they? Well, we know they're not. Most rules have exceptions, but we only learn that over time. So we refine our database of rules over time. And then some rules are just wrong, such as you put petrol in a car, don't you? Unless it's diesel. That's rule rigidity. It's also a wrong rule. But many of you will have seen on the filler cap of a diesel car this diesel only sticker. And that's a really good example of human factors in action. It's putting the information that the individual needs at the point of use. But eventually, we get better at things. So we move on to a skill-based level of performance. And this is now a very familiar task. If you're sitting in your car these days and driving down the road and changing gear, I doubt there's any conscious thought as to what gear you're in. It just happens. And this is good because we can now forward plan, we can coordinate complicated things, we can easily perform more than one task. So we can drive the car, adjust the radio, and talk to a passenger all at the same time. Although I wouldn't advise it. Full attention on the task of driving, please. Now, when we get up to the level of skill, there are yet more errors that can creep in here. The first one would be a behavioral spoonerism. Now, if you don't know what a spoonerism is, please look it up afterwards, but it's basically where you switch syllables from the front of two different words and it gives you a different phrase. But in terms of task performance, I'm sure you've all heard of somebody putting the keys in the fridge and the milk by the front door. That's a behavioral spoonerism. You have changed or swapped two parts of two different actions. I've got ripping the tops off the sweetener bags and pouring the sweetener into the garbage and then dropping the tops into the teacup. That was relayed to me by a friend of mine, and the putting the carrot peel in the water and the carrots in the bin was me when I was totally distracted one evening in the kitchen. Trust me, the rest of the household had a really good laugh about that one. Then you get crosstalk between different tasks, and this was my parents' Saturday supermarket run. They would drive from Corpach in the Scottish Highlands round to Fort William, where we'd go and shop in the Morrisons there. But that was my mother's weekday commute. Now, it probably doesn't take too long to realize that the first 4 miles of that journey are identical. And my brother and I lost track of the number of times that we landed up driving down Glen Nevis rather than heading into Fort William. Very easy to do. Plenty of things on my parents' mind at the time. Probably, you know, my brother and I misbehaving in the back of the car as much as anything. But it's very easy for that to happen in the workplace. If you've not seen the video from the Chemical Safety Board in the United States on the Formosa Plastics incident, that is a perfect example of crosstalk. Now, again, at the level of skill, situational awareness crops in. How aware are you of what's going on around you? because our working environment can be complex. There can be a lot of things happening around you, and understanding all of that is vital. Now, please excuse the quality of the clip. It's the best I can find, but this is a really good example of someone losing situational awareness. I think we can agree, whether we like football or not, that's a bad day at the office. And situational awareness, this is very much about the state of the plant, the weather, the spatial awareness, our perception of what's going on. Then our understanding of that and our ability to project what might happen next. Right, moving on. Situational awareness is affected by a lot of different factors that can be influenced by management. Stress, fatigue, expertise, workload, distraction, information overload. If situational awareness, or the ability to understand our situation, is key, then it is absolutely vital that we make sure that people have the mental workspace to focus on what they're doing. Now, I mentioned several times already that we can lose track of things changing in front of us. What I have for you now is an advert that was circulated by the Mayor of London. However, it is a whodunit, a reveal, a crime reveal that's been set up. And in the background, there are a number of changes. So pay close attention, take a look at the background, and see how many changes you notice.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
How did you know?
Madam, as any horticulturist will tell you, one does not plant petunias until May is out. Take her away.
Sorry, madam.
It's just a matter of observation. The real question is, how observant were you?
Action.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
Now, I have watched that video probably more than 100 times. I still can't see all the changes. So again, here we're seeing a bit of information overload as well, but it could just go to show how much we can miss that changes right in front of us. It's also worth having a look at the door study by Simons and Levin. There's a video on YouTube, and it actually shows that you can change the person that you are talking to right in front of you, and you only have a 50% chance of noticing. If you don't believe me, look up the door study. Now, In terms of the error frequencies, we find that the fewest errors are at the knowledge-based level, and they increase as we get better at the task, which is interesting because that might lead us to say we want to make sure everybody's really concentrating on the task and everyone's always operating at knowledge-based level. But actually, it's a double-edged sword because what we find is most of our errors at the level of skill are detected and corrected. And we know this to be true when we've selected the wrong gear in the car or gone to. At the level of rules, it's about a 50-50 chance. And at the level of knowledge, it's only a 25% chance of detecting and correcting the error because we simply do not have the knowledge or experience to actually understand what's going on. So in terms of our error types, I am only going to be taking a look at error this evening. Skill-based error and mistakes. We don't have time to look at violations. That's a whole nother discussion. But please note, a violation is not sabotage because that's a criminal offense. Violations are when people deviate from written processes, and they do that for many reasons. But we have a slip, and that's when somebody does something, but it's not what they meant to do. And a lapse is when somebody forgets to do something. So the first is an act of commission, an error of commission. You've actively done something. Whereas the lapse is an error of omission. Somebody has forgotten to do something. They're unintended unintended actions with unintended consequences. That's actually quite important because these only happen when somebody's operating at the level of skill and their conscious mind is not on the task. The result of that is retraining this individual will have no effect. So a few examples here. We have recognition failures, memory and storage failures, attention failures, strong habit intrusions like my inability to make a cup of black coffee. It's also worth taking a look at the Tenerife disaster. That was a strong habit intrusion. And the turning right instead of left, that's Formosa Plastics. Again, have a look. And interference errors happen here. These behavioral spoonerisms. Then we get into mistakes. Now, mistakes are where the planned action is incorrect. Now, Don Holmstrom, the American accident investigator, said that no one plans to make a mistake. So this doesn't seem quite right. It's merely that our planning itself was incorrect. We've executed the task as we intended. It's just we got it wrong. An example of that with rule-based mistakes is when the wrong rules applied. So it used to be quite common in hospitals to give an aspirin for a headache. These days, it's paracetamol or acetaminophen that's given. Why? Because a certain number of the patients are asthmatic and they can't have aspirin. There's a rule exception here. So they've changed the rule, and for a headache, you get a paracetamol. Or in the real world, in our analytical labs, maybe, an employee rounds all the values in a calculation instead of only the final value, generating an out-of-spec result. And that's a rule misapplication. You only round the end value. Or one that I learnt about through an HSE course where an electrician assumed the circuit was dead because the indicator light was out. Unfortunately, the indicator light was not working. The circuit was very much live. And the electrician, unfortunately, landed up dead. So we then get to knowledge-based mistakes. Now, this is where you're trying to reason something through from first principles. Now you're open to confirmation bias, short-term memory overload, poor communication, vision problems, fatigue. It's open season as to the sources of error. But taking a look at that classification gives us an inroad as to how to tackle these errors. Now, when we are planning to do a task, we initially perceive something needs done. We interpret what that is. We evaluate how we might do it. We decide what our end goal will be. We decide we're going to do it. We plan and then we act. Now, if you're picking up that donut that's been offered to you, that probably happens in under a second. But if you're doing some DIY at the weekend, that could take you all week. In here, we have memory. And if we go straight from perceiving that something's to be done and then acting, we're operating at the level of skill. And here we are open to slips and lapses. If we have to go far as interpreting what needs to be done, we're now operating at the level of rule-based performance, and rule-based mistakes can come in. So the wrong rule or an inadvisable rule. If, on the other hand, we have to reason through the entire task from scratch, we are operating at the level of knowledge. But it is a continuum, and in the same situation, you can see elements of all three. So at one end, you've got unconscious automatic actions, and at the other end, you've got conscious deliberated behavior. Now, we all do a risk assessment, I hope, but if we drift from our risk assessment over time and maybe accept minor non-conformances, or perhaps there's poor management decisions that persist, we can over time turn this into this. Normalization of deviance is the phrase coined by NASA to explain the over 250 deviations from the launch protocol of the shuttle that resulted in this disaster. So even though we might have set things up well, planned things well, error and poor decisions can still come in over time. And you may be familiar with the Swiss cheese model of error. The blocks of cheese are our defenses against things going wrong, but then we nibble away at them and these holes appear, and eventually a hazard is going to find its way through and we have an accident. It's worth learning about human error and how humans operate, because we can start to spot where these holes are. James Reason referred to them as resident pathogens in the organization. Defects is just as good. And if we learn about human error and we pay attention to our near misses, hopefully we can find ways to guard against and actually close up some of these holes. We're never going to catch all of them, but we don't have to. We just have to catch the ones we know about. And through the application of human error theory and attention to the human errors that are being made, we can slowly make our organization more reliable. And also, it's, life's too short to make all the mistakes ourselves. Actually listening to incident and accident reports that you hear about at conferences and, what other people report and applying those lessons to our own workplace is vital. So how are we going to reduce human error? We saw at the top of this presentation that poor procedures are likely to result in poor outcomes. So what errors can be made? Because work as done versus work as conceived in an office can be very different indeed. So if someone is sitting in an office and writing a procedure without the input from the people who actually do the work, you're going to have a poor procedure. But there are a lot of things we can do here by taking a look at what deviations there have been in this area, making sure we do a proper job hazardous analysis and a good risk assessment. But checklists. Checklists are how we combat skill-based error. We get people into the mindset that they don't trust their own memory. After all, a pilot doesn't trust their own memory when they go and fly a plane. They have a checklist and they diligently go through every step of it, regardless of whether they need to or not, because it stops them forgetting things. Sure, they are probably skilled enough to get in and take that plane and fly it somewhere without the checklist. I personally would prefer they used it. And if you've got unusual or uncommon circumstances, maintenance is the big one. Something that you only do maybe once or twice a year. Make sure the procedures are doubly good and that people review them before they go and do it, because you don't build up much experience on occasional tasks. Do our staff have the skills and knowledge to perform the task? So we might need to think about competence criteria, skills matrices. We might need to measure skill gaps. We need to think about refresher training and know-how versus do-how. If there's a difference between work as conceived and work as done, there's an awful lot of difference between work as taught and work as actioned. And making sure that those two actually marry up is very important. And training people, we forget things over time, actually quite quickly. But we can combat that by returning to the learning via different modes at different times. Fine, go on a course somewhere, but then hopefully they send you some course materials. Do you pick them up and read them? You're probably as bad as me and they get filed away in the cabinet. We don't look at them and then we go, what was that again? But actually, going on a course or being taught something is the first stage of learning. Over time, we've got to revisit that information so that we flatten out the forgetting curve. Workload. If the task you're doing is safety critical or even just performance critical, taking the time to make sure you've got the right number of people in the right place at the right time and that you've taken account of their individual pressures is going to result in a better outcome. Yes, it might take more time to set things up, but if you want to waste time, try having an accident. And confirmation bias, well, it's everywhere. So just a quick question for you. How many triangles are there? You can answer in the chat if you want to. I'll put you out of your misery here and say that if you've actually started trying to count the triangles, you've just been a victim of confirmation bias, because you've assumed because I'm asking that there are triangles there. There are 3 circles with a bite out of them and 3 V's in different configuration that make it look like there might be triangles there. So again, here, communication of the task is really important. Making sure that communication is effective is really important in some areas. In the voluntary services, so St Andrew's Ambulance, very similar to St John's Ambulance, I used to be the comms officer at Murrayfield Stadium, which was great because I got used to get to go and watch the rugby for free, even if Scotland did lose a bit too often. But we had very clear call signs so that it was unmistakable on the radio. We used the NATO alphabet to communicate various things. In the airline industry, pilots confirm 2 or 3 times that the other person is understood. We need to eliminate jargon. I work in the pharmaceutical industry and I'm still finding jargon that I have to ask what it is years after moving into the sector. And we've got to make sure that communication is open, that there is no hierarchy when it comes to getting things done, and that actually management are very tolerant of people asking questions to understand what needs to be done. Because otherwise, people will make assumptions. They will think they've understood that the task is to count the triangles. And if you ever hand over jobs between teams, are the right people involved? It's all very well getting handover between two teams, but if the managers aren't also there, if other departments that are affected by that work aren't also there, you might not have a complete picture of the task and where things are. Your situational awareness might not be complete. And alarm handling. How many different things go beep and what does it mean? Do they sound different or do they sound similar to each other? We need to be on the lookout for error traps as well. These are situations that repeatedly provoke error in the same or in fact different people. So if you ever hear the "oh no, not again" phrase uttered, there's an error trap somewhere. And again, I'm borrowing from the playground here. I have an error trap here for you. And it's just, what kind of tree grows from an acorn? Well, it's an oak. What do you call a funny story? A joke. And you can do this along with me. What rises from a bonfire? Smoke. What noise does a frog make? Croak. What do you call the white of an egg? If you thought yolk, you've just been caught by priming, because I get you into a pattern. The only time in training using this that I have not caught anybody in the room was when I was talking to a group of avian scientists, and they all said albumin. So the egg was very much on my face that day. I had lost my situational awareness. So can training reduce human error? I've already said the answer is yes and no. Because training will reduce mistakes, because this is about experience and knowledge, but it's completely ineffective against slips and lapses. You need a checklist, and you need to have a culture where it's normal to use that. Atul Gawande wrote an excellent book called The Checklist Manifesto. I cannot recommend it highly enough. But fundamentally, we need to make people's life easy. This on one page is an aircraft checklist. This is what the pilots use when they're flying us around the world. It's all on one sheet of paper. And they use it diligently, mainly because they've got quite a lot of interest in not having an accident themselves. After all, they are the first to arrive at the scene of an accident. But we're quite used to seeing fire action signs, because whilst we'll train people what to do in an emergency, do we actually expect them to remember where the assembly point is? No, you can check it on your way out. And we've already talked about diesel fuel only. This is putting things at the point of use. There are a lot of other good examples here, like in the catering industry, color-coded chopping boards for different types of food. Introducing those massively reduced the amount of food poisoning from people eating out. So human factors, we need to take our time to understand human psychology and how people work. But often the solutions are fairly straightforward. Now, I'm just going to have to move briefly because the light has just gone off on me. So, does anybody have any questions?
That was super interesting, Rosie. So many things I could relate to. Two in particular was the coffee machine. That reminded me of a certain online retailer who likes to move the subscription and the single purchase buttons around, or the buy now and put things in your basket, because you hit where you usually hit. And then they've moved everything around. Before you know where you are, you've signed up to something that you hadn't intended. And then the other one was the information overload. I can look at something like if I looked at it now and I would think, oh, I can't cope with this. I don't know what it is. I don't understand. But I've grown to understand that if I look at it tomorrow, I can understand everything and know what to do with it. But I related to so much of what you said. Right, that's enough what I think. Let's have a look at what our attendees thought. So we've got a question from Patrick. How much will multitasking contribute to workplace risks, even if they did not involve any incident?
Hugely, actually. I've said that we can perform multiple things at the same time. We can, but we can't do it reliably. A really good example of this is dispensing medicines on hospital wards. The nurse would do the medication round, and medication errors were well known. So in the NHS, they decided that what they would do is they'd put a second nurse on the task to make sure that every dispensing of a medication was checked and countersigned. Except the error rate went up, not down, because the nurses were still under the same time pressure as before. Only now they were talking about what was on last night's TV or any other gossip in the hospital. So the error rate went up. Besides, they trusted each other to get things right. So there was biased reviewing. The solution now, if you see someone on a medication round, is they are usually wearing a high-vis tabard that says medication round, do not disturb. And whilst they're wearing that, they may not be disturbed and there is no time pressure. The medication round takes as long as it takes. And now dispensing errors are very rare because we've given people the mental space to do the job. So if you want things done well and reliably, avoid multitasking.
Great, thank you. Patrick's also said, well done, this is beyond the norm. I think that's a big compliment. He wants to know also if you would be willing to share your slides.
I'm always willing to share my slides. And Patrick, if you want to get directly in touch, I have a much longer slide set on this topic. Just get in touch either through Julie or directly via LinkedIn. I'm always happy to talk about human factors.
Great. And my name is really long, so if you want to contact me, if you just email branches@IIRSM.org, and then I can get those across to you. And then we've got some comments from Rachel. Let me just turn the participants off and then I can see the whole. So this is from Rachel. When I process map procedures to identify potential for human error events, I found interruptions to personnel were a risk factor and appeared more than expected, i.e. stopping to accept delivery, a maintenance visit, or receiving a phone call, etc. I'm not sure if this next comment is related, but it's also from Rachel. Staff absence also increased the risk factor of task failure within a team as time pressure and workload increased.
So those interruptions are much more common than we think. And how many of us have got a mobile phone that's in our pockets and it buzzes and then we go, where was I? If the task that you're doing requires focus, then you should have no interruptions. But that's entirely in the control of management.
Great, thank you. Rachel also says get my teeth in. Skill-based performance would be a good section to include in workplace competency assessment for safety critical tasks.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, when it is safety critical, it's making sure that that concentration is there. You know, there are certain tasks that you don't want to be doing whilst thinking about what you're going to make for tea tonight.
I mean, I can think of the mistakes I might make, which might just be a spelling mistake or setting a webinar up on the wrong day, but some of the people jobs they do, it could be catastrophic.
I keep my knives in the kitchen very, very sharp. And I have occasionally not been concentrating on what I was doing and relying on skill-based performance. And shortly after, in both cases, had to be stitched up again at the hospital.
Ouch, painful.
Yeah.
So I think we've got another question here. I think it's just lots of compliments. So this is from
Oh.
Richard. Thanks, Rosie. I always get so much from your presentations and really enjoy the examples you give. I agree with that. I love your presentations. And then we've got another couple in the chat. This was so good. Well done. Informative and thought-provoking. Great stuff. I echo everything. I always listen to your webinars. Sometimes I don't. I must admit, I'm guilty of not listening to webinars because I do so many of them. But I found it thoroughly interesting. We could probably chat for quite a while. But so thank you so much.
I'm certainly aware that we're out of time, and thank you everybody for coming along this evening. This is a passion topic of mine. What I would say, and I don't get any kickback for this, if you want to learn more about human factors in accident investigation, go to the Health and Safety Laboratory in Buxton. They run a 2-day course there that is excellent. It is worth every penny.
Great. Thank you for that, Rosie. Thank you, everyone, for attending this evening. I think it might be this evening where everyone is from. If you want to keep a lookout for the London branch events, we've hopefully got a face-to-face breakfast meeting coming up in October, and then we've got a webinar on sleep in November. So if you keep your eye out, we'll be promoting those shortly. So I would like to thank Rosie again, thank everyone for attending, and wish everyone a good evening. Bye, everyone.
Bye.